Let me kind of give you the roadmap for where we're headed this morning in Daniel chapter 6. There's two things that the author of the chapter wants us to understand. First of all, the author of Daniel 6 teaches us that we can trust God to deliver us even if his deliverance isn't what we had expected or hoped. We can trust God to deliver us even if his deliverance isn't what we had expected or hoped. And the second thing is this: God's children can trust him even if the deliverance is slow in coming. God's children can trust him even if the deliverance is slow in coming. So the children of Israel, they have been in exile in Babylon for decades now. And those who had spent most, if not all of their lives in Babylon had to battle the temptation to ignore God's law. You know, the thinking kind of goes like this: when in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do, or to get along, you must go along. Many of them may have thought, why continue to be obedient to the law of God when doing so opens me up for discrimination and persecution? Why risk the potential abuse that obedience to God's law could bring? You know, those are two very important questions, not only for them back then, but for us today. From all outward appearances, Israel has lost. Jerusalem has been ransacked. The temple has been destroyed. And all the holy vessels now reside in the treasuries of Babylon. At first, it starts out as perhaps a rumor, a whisper. And then it grows to a crescendo that the children of Israel learn that indeed mighty Babylon has fallen. Word has come to the exiles that King Belshazzar has died, and the Medes and the Persians have toppled the Babylonian Empire. Could it be that happy days were here again? Well, in Daniel 6, we are formally introduced to a new ruler over Babylon. His name is Darius. And Darius began his reign by instituting an empire-wide reorganization. Look at verses 1 and 2. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Now, that's not a word we use all the time. Simply means these men were set up to be protectors of the kingdom, to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. The king was concerned about the inevitable corruption that characterizes many government officials, and so he sets up these 120 satraps, these 120 protectors of the kingdom, as a system of checks and balances. Then over these protectors of the kingdom, over the 120, there were 3 high-ranking officials. You might call them regional presidents. And the purpose of these 3 presidents was to make sure that the king was getting all the taxes that was being withheld from the people. So they had an important job. They had a lot of responsibility. And as we've repeatedly seen here in the book of Daniel, the cream rises to the top. And Daniel, lo and behold, here he is in his mid-80s, is in line for another promotion. This guy had a career path like no other. Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And notice, the king plainly set him over the whole kingdom. And this is where it all starts to go south for Daniel. What happens next really shouldn't be any surprise to us. Whenever a person is promoted to a position of prominence, guess what? Those who didn't get the position turn green with envy. And that's exactly what happened here to Daniel. King Darius had settled in his mind to promote Daniel to be the one sole ruler, the one sole president over all these other men. And those who thought they should have received the promotion, those who thought that that was their job, they can't believe that Daniel has taken this away from them. Now, they're upset. After all this, Daniel, who was he? He was nothing more than an exile. He was a captive. This guy is simply a slave from Judah. You know, we may think that character assassination is something new in politics, but it's not. Because that's exactly what's happening here to Daniel. It existed in Daniel's day. His enemies set out to discredit him. They set out to ruin his reputation. They set out to disgrace him and to disqualify him in the eyes of the king. But Daniel was such a man of sterling character, and despite all their best efforts, they couldn't find nothing to discredit him. They could find nothing to tarnish his reputation for integrity. And finally, all they could come up with was his faith, was his obedience to God. They said, we shall not find any ground for a complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. They believed that his faith was his weakness, when in reality it was his strength. They misread Daniel, didn't they? They didn't understand anything at all about Daniel. And that's an amazing thing. The only place, the only thing in his life where they could find any potential vulnerabilities or any kind of liability was his relationship to God. They knew that he was loyal to his God. They knew that he was obedient to God. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that was the only vulnerability and liability that we have? That when people look at our lives, they say, the only thing I can find fault with them is they pray too much. They serve too much. They're far too obedient to their God. Let me say this to the young people. Be careful of your actions now, because they may come back later on to haunt you in life and be used to disqualify you. Just because you do something amongst friends doesn't mean that it's a secret. Doesn't mean that it won't come back to haunt you someday. So the plot they hatched against Daniel was to convince the king that it would be in the king's best interest to sign this law or this injunction that stipulated that no one could pray to any other god or could pray to any other man for the king, except the king, for the next 30 days. And if anyone dared to defy the king, the punishment would be swift, the punishment would be severe. They would be tossed into a den full of hungry lions. And this law or this injunction, once it had been signed, once it was issued, it would be impossible to be revoked even by the king. And they must have thought, we have an airtight plane here. What could possibly go wrong? Well, just an observation or two here about Daniel. His character was well known. They knew that not only was he a man of prayer, but that he was a man of principle. They knew that he was a man of integrity. They knew that he was so devoted to God that he would be obedient to God at any and all cost. What a wonderful character, what a wonderful testimony Daniel had. They knew, listen, they knew when they got the king to sign this injunction, there was absolutely no way that Daniel would obey it. They knew that going in. And Daniel is a living illustration of what Peter said in the New Testament when the religious ruler said, hey, stop preaching Christ, stop talking about Jesus. And what did Peter say? We have to obey God rather than men. And that's exactly what Daniel was doing here. And I wonder about us, have we stopped to wonder how we would respond if our government outlawed Christianity? There was a time in my life when I thought that would be impossible. I thought that we would always be free to openly worship God and to pray to my Heavenly Father without fear of penalty or persecution. I don't necessarily believe that anymore. And what if the unthinkable happens? What if with the stroke of a pen, or what if with the ruling of a Supreme Court, our religious liberty is taken away and reading the Bible and praying becomes a crime? I was reading an article this week about North Korea. To even own a Bible in North Korea is a crime. They will arrest you. They will put you in jail. They will put you in prison. And the government's so sneaky about it, they're going up to kids in elementary school and asking what they would say is an innocent question. Does your family have a Bible? And the poor, unsuspecting child would say what? Yes. And guess what? Mom and dad end up in jail. See. And see, it's better to prepare yourself now for what might not happen than to wait until it does happen and then try and prepare yourself. How could these men convince the king to implement this injunction? Well, actually, it was very easy. You know why? They played to his pride. They played to his vanity. They made him feel special. They elevated himself in his own mind. They stroked his ego. They said, hey, king, we've got a great way of branding you. We'll make you a brand. That's the only reason that I can figure that he threw his own reason out the window so quickly. Why else would he do this? He forgot his feelings that he had about Daniel, feelings which quickly become apparent. Know this, folks. These men were not trying to keep Daniel from praying. That was not the end game. You know what the end game was? They wanted Daniel dead. They wanted Daniel destroyed. That was their ultimate goal. And verse 10 makes it clear that Daniel wasn't caught off guard by anything that's going on. Look at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, now I take that to mean he was aware of the plan. He was aware of the fact that these men were trying to influence the king. And so when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he didn't panic. He didn't picket. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he has done previously. Know this, Daniel is not showboating here. Daniel's not trying to stand out from everybody else. He's not trying to make his own statement. He continued to do what he had always done throughout his life. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, he prayed 3 times a day. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed and thanked his God. It was his way of life. He was a man of prayer. He was a man of integrity, and he wasn't about to change now. Think about the life of Daniel. Think of some of the other occurrences in the life of Daniel that we've already looked at. Don't you think that the temptation existed there to compromise? Well, sure. But he didn't compromise then, and he wasn't about to compromise now. And how easy it would have been to compromise, how easy it would have been to rationalize this. It's only 30 days. He could have had a little self-talk. It's only 30 days. I prayed faithfully for the last 70 years. I think 30 days I could take off. I wonder how many of us have gone 30 days without praying. He could have said, it's just 30 days. I can take a little break from my prayer life. What's the big deal? He could have said, well, you know what? I could wait until the middle of the night. Instead of praying 3 times a day, I'll wrap them all up in one little bit longer prayer, and I'll do it in the dark, and nobody will see. He could have said, well, I'll slip away somewhere private, out of the way. I'll lock the door to my office, and nobody will know what's going on. He could have rationalized any of those options, but I don't believe for a second that anything like that ever entered his mind. That was not Daniel. He continued his lifelong pattern of prayer. He goes upstairs. He goes to his upper chamber that has this window that opens and looks out towards Jerusalem. And what does he do? He sinks to his knees. He bows his head and he prays. He gives thanks to God. And notice the narrator says, as he had done previously. This was his way of life. This is what he was going to continue to do. Now notice Daniel's enemies, they catch him in the act. Look at verse 11. Then these men came by agreement. What a bunch of snakes. They hated Daniel so much, they're making their own little pact. We'll get this guy. One way or another, we're going to get this guy. They had this all worked out. They had Daniel in their crosshairs, and they got their man. They were more concerned about their own status, their own positions, their own well-being, far more than they were concerned about the welfare of the king or the protection of the king or the welfare of the people of the land. They were just looking out for themselves. And immediately upon catching Daniel in the act of praying, they go to the king and remind him that the injunction was now in force. They remind him that anyone who prayed to anybody else except the king for 30 days was to be thrown into the lion's den. And having reminded the king of the injunction that he had instituted, they, and I think with a certain amount of glee, told them that Daniel had defied his order, that Daniel had been caught in the act of praying to his God, to the God of Israel, and not praying to King Darius. And the text says what? The king is distressed upon hearing this news. Why? Because the folly of his way has caught up with him. He realizes, what have I done? The man who I trusted, who I saw such integrity in, the very thing that I admired this man for, now I have to put him to death for. King, what were you thinking? See what happens when we let our pride overcome us? Do you see what happens when we get swelled with vanity? Reason goes out the window. So he spends the rest of the day. In that culture, the sentence had to be executed on the same day, and it had to be executed by sundown. So apparently this happens earlier in the day, so he spends the rest of the day trying to find a loophole, trying to find a way to save Daniel from what he knew would be certain death. Yet despite all his efforts, and with a heavy heart, he finally issues the command, and Daniel is brought, and Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. I'll give this much credit to the king. From the text, I think it's obvious that he was there when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Well, I say that because the text says, he says to Daniel, "May your God whom you serve continually deliver you." He doesn't want to do this. He realizes what the mistake that he's made, and he hopes that Daniel's God will save him from the lions. Obviously, the king has some level of affection for Daniel. And one has to wonder why the king didn't do like they did in the days of Esther. Why didn't he issue another injunction that could have set this aside? But for whatever reason, he didn't. And after putting Daniel into the lion's den, which was really a cistern hewn out of the rock down into the ground, they put on the stone cover was placed on top of what Daniel's enemies hoped would be his final resting place, his tomb. The stone was sealed with the signet of the kings and the lords. Why? So that nothing could be changed concerning Daniel. Daniel's fate was what? Sealed. Now, God's design for Daniel did not include immediate deliverance. Make no mistake about it, Daniel went into the pit with the lions, hungry lions, wild lions, ferocious lions, powerful lions. And with a heart heavy with despair and with a dark sense of foreboding hanging over him, the king retired to his chambers for the night. But there would be no sleep for the king this night. There would be no entertainment for the king this night. There wouldn't even be any food for the king this night. And the king becomes like the caged animal, and he paces back and forth. Minute after minute, hour after hour. Each minute must have seemed like an eternity as he waited for the nighttime to give way to daylight. And when daybreak finally came, the king rushed back to the pit, which he had hoped had not turned into the tomb. And you can imagine the king issuing the command as soon as he leaves his living quarters. Get that stone off of there and get it off of there now. He has to know what has happened. Has Daniel's God come through? Notice what verse 20 says. As he came nearer to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. He knew he had sentenced an innocent man to death. And in anguish, he says, the king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" The king is in desperate need to hear the voice of Daniel. And those around the king, I wonder, hearing the anguish and the brokenness in his voice, I wonder if they just fell deathly silent. And in what must have seemed like an eternity, finally, the silence is broken with the sweetest words that the king has heard in a very long time. From the darkness of the pit comes his strong and cheery voice, "Oh, king, live forever." Daniel goes on to say, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. I'm fighting the temptation to use my imagination to describe what may have happened in the lion's den. The Bible doesn't say, so I won't. All we need to know is the angel was there. God delivered Daniel in an unexpected way. His deliverance came in the form of divine protection. Daniel did spend the night with the lions, but they were not the only other ones in the pit. Who else was there? God's angel. And in my mind's eye, I picture that God's angel was waiting for Daniel. Before Daniel hit the bottom of the cistern, before he ever saw the glint of the lion's teeth, he saw the gleam of the glory of God's angel. Now, it did take a night for Daniel to get out of the pit, but his deliverance started long before that. I can't help but wonder about the men who had hatched this plan. Did they too, as soon as morning broke, head for the lion's den? Or I wonder, were they at home starting their day with a nice breakfast, thinking they've rid themselves once and for all of Daniel? Well, the word goes out from the king to round up all those who were responsible for convincing him to issue the injunction that had led to Daniel being thrown into the pit. So simultaneously, raids are carried out in the morning dawn. The early morning silence is now replaced with the cries and the pleas of the condemned men and their families as they are rounded up and herded towards the lion's den. They know what awaits them. See, in that culture, if you falsely accuse someone, you suffered the same fate. The scriptures tell us that even before their bodies had reached the floor of the cistern, their bodies were intercepted by the lions, and they broke all the bones of their bodies. You say, do you take that literally? I do. I do. They were starving. They were starving, and they had prey in front of them all night long, but they couldn't get to it. Why? The angel. I don't think they even advanced on Daniel. But now, the angel's gone. Daniel's gone. They are thrown into the pit, and they pounce. All this proves what a miracle Daniel's deliverance was. Again, they would have attacked and killed Daniel if it had not been for the presence of the angel. And so therefore, they personally met the fate that they had planned for Daniel. Then the king goes on, and he issues another edict to all the people, that all the people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Why? Well, he says, for he is a living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonder in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. And then, almost rubbing salt into the wounds, I think, the narrator says, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Word of warning to anybody else out there looking to take Daniel down. See, the salvation of Daniel demonstrated in vivid terms that God indeed was sovereign. This was the message that God wanted his people in exile to understand. Therefore, he repeatedly demonstrates his sovereignty both over their enemies as well as in the lives of his own people. He demonstrated that he was sovereign over their enemies by doing what? By toppling the Babylonian Empire. He took the kingdom from them. Now mark this. He took the kingdom from the Babylonians and gave it to the Medes and the Persians, which was the kingdom that issued the order that the temple could be rebuilt and the exiles who wanted to could go home. And he demonstrated that he was sovereign over his own people when he saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace. And when he demonstrated he was sovereign over his own people when he saved Daniel from the lion's den. See, the salvation of Daniel proved to the people that he, their God, could be trusted to use his sovereignty on their behalf and for their good. The sovereignty of God is not a doctrine to be accepted intellectually and then left in the dusty recesses of our mind. The sovereignty of God is a doctrine to rest in. It's a doctrine to be comforted by. It's a doctrine to help you cope with the tough times of life. A doctrine to help you deal with the reality, though you think you are in control, that you are really not in control. A doctrine to help you deal with the events of life that are not going your way, that are not going the way that you want them to go. Let me say it again. The sovereignty of God is a doctrine to help you deal with the events of life that are not going your way. The sovereignty of God is a doctrine to help you deal with those situations and those circumstances that for whatever reason you're trying to control, but you know in your heart that you can't and you aren't. Do you know what I find to be a contradiction in terms? A Christian who says they're a control freak. And so many times as Christians, we say that as a badge of honor. Oh, I'm just a control freak. No, what you're saying publicly is that you just don't trust the sovereignty of God, and you're going to try and have to control all the situations of your life. Recipe for frustration. So, what is that one thing in your life right now that's dominating your thoughts? What is that one thing in your life right now that's keeping you up at night? What is the one thing that's straining your relationship to a neighbor, a coworker, a family member, a friend? What is it? Whatever it is, ask yourself, am I resting in the sovereignty of God in this situation? Am I trusting that God knows best? See, God puts us in the pit at times to show us that He's still sovereign and that He can be trusted even when we find ourselves in situations that we cannot control, in situations that keep us up at night, in situations that create anxiety in our lives. It's good to honor God on top of the pit. It's even better to honor God in the pit. It's easy to trust God out of the pit. It's much harder to trust God in the pit. Our trust in God must always be based upon His character, not our circumstances. Our trust in God must always be based upon His character, not our circumstances. You trust in the sovereignty of God for your salvation, I presume. You trust in the sovereignty of God for your eternal soul. Therefore, you can trust Him with X, whatever that is. You can trust Him with your children. You can trust Him with your job. You can trust Him with those relationships. There's not anything in your life that you can't trust His sovereignty in. My mother, God bless her, I never could understand this about her. We'll talk to her about this. She says she trusted in God for her salvation. Then why can't you trust him for a 10-minute car ride? And I'm not making fun of my mother. It grieves me to think how her life was filled with anxiety and worry. How can you trust the almighty God of the universe for your salvation, but you can't trust him in this seemingly insignificant situation? But I'm afraid a lot of us are like my mother. We do trust God for our eternal soul, but yet when it comes to the everyday details of our lives, we have a difficult time trusting him. So what do? Preach the gospel to yourself. Remind yourself that God loves you, and he has expressed his love for you through the person of Christ. And because he loves you as he loves Christ, never ever forget that. He loves you like he loves Christ. Because he loves you as he loves Christ, he wants to make you like Christ. In order to make you like Christ, he must refine you. He must teach you to trust him like Christ trusted his Father. And just like Daniel trusted his father.